It begins in a silent government records room in Washington, D.C., late in the first years of the new millennium. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting a pale glow onto rows of metal shelves stacked with cardboard boxes stamped Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. A federal archivist pulls one box forward, the motion releasing a faint breath of dust into the still air. Inside are files that were never meant to be seen, yellowed memos on CIA letterheads, Army intelligence summaries, immigration dossiers stamped secret, and a crisp, typewritten title that appears again and again: Operation Paperclip. For decades, the United States insisted that only a handful of German scientists with clean records were brought to America after the war. Yet the pages inside these boxes tell another story, a far more complicated one, built from redacted lines, altered biographies, and decisions made when the world was still reeling from the rubble of 1945. As the archivist turns each page, the weight of what the U.S. government finally admitted becomes impossible to ignore, and understanding those admissions requires returning to the moment when the Reich collapsed and the race for its scientists began to in the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich buckled under the relentless advance of Allied armies. Europe lay in a state of collapse so profound that even seasoned soldiers struggled to comprehend its scale. Entire cities have been reduced to skeletal outlines, with charred beams and silent brick shells standing where homes and marketplaces once thrived. The snowmelt flowed through bomb-cratered streets, washing over shattered glass, torn propaganda posters, and the remnants of a regime that had ruled through terror for more than a decade. But amid the ruins, intelligence officers from Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union were discovering something far more unsettling than abandoned military posts or scattered Wehrmacht units. They were finding laboratories, hidden research centers buried in forests, mountains, and tunnel systems, filled with blueprints, prototypes, and equipment that suggested Germany's scientific ambitions had extended well beyond what the world had understood during the war. At places like Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, Allied investigators walked through concrete test stands where flames from the V-2 rocket had once roared skyward. At Dora, Mittelbau, they descended into cold tunnels carved brutally by forced laborers, passing by rusted frames of unfinished rockets lined up in damp underground chambers. The shock was immediate. Germany had built the world's first ballistic missile, a weapon that traveled faster than sound, crossed international borders within minutes, and struck London and Antwerp without warning. It was technology that did not merely exceed Allied expectations, it redefined the boundaries of what seemed possible. The discovery triggered urgent questions. How had Nazi Germany, starved of oil, bombed relentlessly, losing ground on every front, managed to develop weapons that bordered on science fiction? And more importantly, who were the minds behind them? As Allied troops captured documents and interrogated technicians, a pattern emerged. The Third Reich had concentrated its intellectual elites into closed research hubs, gathering physicists, mathematicians, chemists, engineers, aerodynamicists, and medical specialists under military supervision. Lists were found, one in particular, the Ozenberg list, named after engineer Werner Ozenberg, cataloged German scientists considered vital to wartime research. When Allied analysts pieced together the fragments of this list, they realized the names it contained were not mere functionaries. They were some of the most advanced specialists in rocketry, aviation, chemicals, and emerging guidance technologies anywhere in the world. These experts were not simply solving wartime problems. They were building tomorrow's arsenal. No name stood out more than Wernher von Braun, the brilliant, ambitious architect of the V-2 program. His vision for spaceflight had shaped Germany's rocket development long before the war. Yet the system that turned his ideas into weapons was soaked in suffering. At Dora, tens of thousands of forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners had toiled in monstrous conditions, starving, beaten, and worked to death in an environment more deadly than the weapon they were building. Many perished constructing a single rocket. 4 Allied officers walking through those tunnels in 1945. The ethical contradictions were impossible to ignore. Extraordinary technological achievement born from extraordinary human misery. But the geopolitical reality was equally impossible to ignore. The war was ending. A new conflict was beginning. And whoever controlled these scientists would begin the next era of global power with an advantage the world had never seen before. As news spread that Soviet units were capturing German engineering hubs in the east, American intelligence grew increasingly anxious. Reports indicated that the Red Army was rounding up not only equipment but entire research teams, relocating them deeper into Soviet territory. The United States and Britain, still allies on paper, understood that cooperation with Moscow was dissolving by the day. A Cold War was already forming in the shadows of victory parades and occupation zones. In this emerging chessboard, the scientists of Nazi Germany were not criminals, victims, or even enemies. They were pieces of strategic value. Their knowledge could determine who built the next generation of rockets, who reached the upper atmosphere first, and who eventually controlled space itself. By late 1945, American officers were no longer simply interrogating German specialists. They were escorting them, protecting them, even housing them as valuable assets. What began as battlefield intelligence gathering was transforming into a covert competition, one that blurred the lines between necessity and compromise. The world had changed, and with it, the moral calculations of nations desperate to avoid falling behind. It was in this fragile, fractured post-war landscape, filled with rubble, fear, and ambition, that the seeds of America's secret program to recruit Nazi scientists first took root, setting the stage for a far more deliberate and controversial effort that would soon be known by a new name. In the final months of 1945, as occupation zones solidified across a defeated Germany, American military planners faced a dilemma that had grown too large to ignore. They had interrogated the top engineers of the V-2 program, seized technical drawings, and secured crates of equipment. But intelligence reports pouring in from the eastern zones painted a stark picture. Soviet teams were sweeping through factories, research institutes, and residential districts with ruthless efficiency, loading trucks with machinery, prototypes, and entire families of German specialists. In October 1946, the Soviets executed their massive roundup, later known as Operation Osoaviakim, moving thousands of scientists, engineers, and skilled workers to the USSR in a single coordinated operation meant to jumpstart their own missile and aviation programs. American officers realized that if they did not act quickly and decisively, the balance of post-war technology would tilt irreversibly toward Moscow. What had begun as a cautious program of interrogations now shifted into something far more aggressive, calculated, and secretive. The first official attempt to secure German expertise took shape under the name Operation Overcast, approved in July 1945. Its stated purpose was modest: bring a select number of scientists to the United States for temporary evaluation and consultation. But the men selected were not ordinary researchers. They were key figures in the heart of Nazi Germany's military science machine, experts whose work had once been fueled by the vast resources of the Third Reich. As these scientists were brought to the American-occupied zones, their families followed, creating a growing enclave of German specialists under U.S. control. However, the program's ambitions changed as intelligence officers recognized the immense strategic value these individuals possessed. Reports showed that German advancements in rocketry, jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and even chemical and biological sciences were years ahead of American equivalents. Suddenly, the idea of sending these scientists home after a brief consultation seemed not only impractical but dangerous. Inside the War Department, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JOA, began planning a larger, more permanent recruitment effort. This new phase required a clean, bureaucratic foundation, and so Operation Overcast quietly evolved into Operation Paperclip, named after the simple paperclips used to attach new, sanitized biographical notes to personnel files. The reason for those attachments was no mystery. President Truman had issued a directive forbidding the admission of any individual found to be an ardent Nazi or involved in war crimes. But many of the scientists being considered had been party members, held SS or SA ranks, or worked in programs that relied on forced labor. To keep them eligible, officers within the JIOA altered, rephrased, or omitted details from their records, framing them as apolitical technicians rather than individuals who had once served a brutal regime. Some files had entire sections rewritten. Others were selectively purged. The goal was simple: present Truman with dossiers that allowed approval while burying the reality beneath layers of bureaucratic language. By late 1946 and in 1947, trainloads of German scientists and their families began moving not east toward the Soviets, but west, first to American transit points in Germany, then across the Atlantic to new lives under American supervision. They arrived quietly at Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, and later Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where they were assigned to U.S. Army research teams working on missile development. Many traveled using specially arranged military transport. Others entered the country through circuitous routes, including brief stops in Mexico designed to create clean immigration footprints. Their presence was not intended for headlines. When early reports leaked to the American press in 1946 and 1947, the public reaction was mixed: surprise, discomfort, and in some cases anger that former enemy personnel were being granted protection, pay, and the promise of opportunity. The official response from the War Department was cautious, emphasizing national security and the need to stay ahead of Soviet scientific efforts. But behind the scenes, the program expanded rapidly, bringing hundreds of specialists into American laboratories, test sites, and military facilities. Yet even as these scientists began constructing the foundations of America's emerging missile and space programs, the moral questions surrounding Paperclip grew heavier. Officers and bureaucrats understood that they were shaping a narrative, the story of German technological brilliance separated from the story of Nazi brutality. In the climate of the early Cold War, expedience often won. The Soviet threat overshadowed concerns about the past. And so, Paperclip became more than a recruitment effort. It became a strategic gamble, a moral compromise, and a silent partnership between a victorious democracy and men whose wartime work had been entangled in crimes the world was only beginning to comprehend. This tension would not stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before the shadows cast by these decisions began to stretch into the decades that followed, forcing the nation to confront what it had been willing to overlook. To understand the full weight of what Operation Paperclip became, one must examine it from the perspective of the people pulled into its orbit, those who designed the weapons, those who suffered under their creation, and those within the American government who quietly reshaped policy to harness German science for national gain. At the center of the human angle stood men like Wernher von Braun, whose name would one day be synonymous with the Saturn V and the triumph of the Apollo missions. But in the mid-1940s, von Braun was a more complicated figure. To American military officers, he was a visionary engineer whose brilliance could transform the nation's technological future. Yet to survivors of Dora, Mittelbau, he was one of the key architects whose rockets were assembled by tens of thousands of starving prisoners forced to labor underground in darkness, cold, and terror. Many died within weeks of arrival, their bodies consumed by exhaustion and disease, their graves marked only by the memories of those who lived long enough to speak of the horrors they had endured. When von Braun and his team arrived in the United States, they were given housing, salaries, and the chance to continue their scientific dreams. Meanwhile, the men who had died in the tunnels where their rockets were built were seldom mentioned in official documents. The contrast between these two human experiences, privilege on one side and torment on the other, became one of the earliest and most haunting contradictions embedded in Paperclip's legacy. But the technological angle was just as powerful and perhaps even more seductive to those shaping America's emerging Cold War strategy. In the late 1940s, the United States had no long-range missile program, no functioning military rocket capable of piercing the stratosphere, and no aviation technologies matching the glide ratios and aerodynamic sophistication the Germans had achieved. The V-2, though crude by modern standards, represented a leap so significant that American engineers were effectively years behind. German researchers had mastered supersonic wind tunnels, advanced guidance systems, and jet engine designs that pushed the limits of what aviation could achieve. When American analysts studied captured German documents, they realized they were holding blueprints for the future. Paperclip scientists brought with them not only the physical knowledge of how to construct weapons, but entire philosophies of propulsion, material science, and aeronautical engineering. Their contributions accelerated U.S. missile programs at a pace that would have been otherwise impossible, directly influencing developments that led to the Redstone, Jupiter, and later the Saturn series. The cost of acquiring this knowledge, both in moral compromise and in the silencing of unpleasant histories, was significant, but at the time, the promise of technological dominance overshadowed everything else. Within the American leadership structure, this technological potential collided with political reality. Officials inside the State Department, War Department, and soon the newly formed CIA were divided about how far the nation should go in recruiting former Nazis. Some argued that the scientists' skills were indispensable, that the Soviets were already gaining ground, and that America could not afford to be left behind in what was rapidly becoming a global contest for scientific and military superiority. Others insisted that using individuals who had participated directly or indirectly in the machinery of Nazi power violated the principles the Allies had claimed to defend at Nuremberg. Meetings grew tense, debates sharpened, and policy became increasingly shaped by those who believed that expedience, not ideology, would determine who controlled the coming century. These bureaucratic battles left their mark on the structure of Paperclip itself. Files were altered. Security reports were rewritten. Language was softened to portray scientists as reluctant participants in the Nazi system, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Yet within these same agencies were officers who felt uneasy about the deception, individuals who understood that the government was bending its own rules in pursuit of an advantage it could not openly justify. Their discomfort rarely stopped the momentum of Paperclip, but it lingered like a quiet reminder that a line was being crossed. As the program expanded, the interplay between human tragedy, technological ambition, and bureaucratic compromise created a complex landscape where ideals collided with fears and where the pursuit of progress overshadowed the moral weight of the past. These angles did not exist separately. They intertwined, shaping the program's character and foreshadowing the controversies that would emerge decades later. And as each new scientist stepped onto American soil, welcomed with opportunity and shielded by secrecy, the tension between what had happened in the tunnels of Dora and what would soon happen in laboratories across the United States continued to grow, leading inevitably to the deeper, darker angles that define the moral and geopolitical consequences of Paperclip. If the first angles of Operation Paperclip revealed a tangle of human and technological contradictions, the deeper angles exposed something even more unsettling: the moral cost of merging a victorious democracy with men who had served a murderous regime, the geopolitical pressures that justified such decisions, and a shifting public memory that allowed the story to disappear beneath the bright glow of the space race. At the heart of the moral angle was a stark contradiction that haunted post-war justice. In 1945 and 1946, the world gathered in Nuremberg to declare that those who committed or facilitated crimes against humanity would be held accountable. American prosecutors presented mountains of evidence showing the brutality of Nazi policies, including the exploitation of forced labor in underground rocket factories. Yet at the same moment, other arms of the U.S. government were preparing contracts, visas, and living arrangements for some of the engineers whose work had been carried out on the backs of those very victims. American officials insisted that the scientists being brought over were necessary for national survival. But the reality was harder to reconcile. The pursuit of technological advantage had begun to reshape the meaning of justice itself. The moral discomfort did not disappear. It simply went unspoken, buried beneath classifications and sealed files that would remain hidden for decades. These moral compromises were fueled by an enemy whose threat grew more imposing with each passing year. The Cold War was not an abstraction in 1946. It was already forming in Berlin's divided streets, in the Soviet seizure of German technical experts, and in intelligence assessments warning that Stalin intended to match or surpass American military capabilities at any cost. To many U.S. strategists, the Soviet Union's aggressive recruitment and relocation of German specialists signaled a new kind of arms race, one fought not with tanks or infantry, but with equations, engineers, and theories. If the Soviets possessed long-range missiles years before the United States, they could overshadow American nuclear capabilities and shift the balance of power. It was a fear that took on existential weight, and it reshaped American decision-making from the inside out. Paperclip was not framed simply as an opportunity, but as a necessity, an urgent measure to prevent a future in which the Soviet Union held a technological monopoly. Under this logic, the personal histories of German scientists became secondary to the larger geopolitical game. Even individuals whose pasts were deeply troubling were shielded because their knowledge was seen as too valuable to lose. The enemy's shadow justified the erasure of inconvenient truths, and the American government, like many governments facing a powerful rival, chose expedience over consistency. Meanwhile, another angle unfolded, not in laboratories or intelligence offices, but in the public sphere, shaped by the narratives that Americans absorbed through newspapers, magazines, and later television screens. In the 1950s and 1960s, as von Braun and his team moved from military missile programs to the newly formed NASA, public memory began to treat them less as former Germans with complex wartime pasts and more as heroic pioneers pushing the boundaries of human achievement. Photographs showed smiling engineers standing beside towering rockets. Newspapers celebrated the breakthroughs of Huntsville, calling it the Rocket City. Television programs portrayed space exploration as the symbol of American ingenuity and moral strength. Almost no one mentioned the dark tunnels of Dora, Mittelbau, or the thousands who had died building the weapons that launched von Braun's career. The official narrative polished the past until only the most convenient parts gleamed. It wasn't that Americans were intentionally misled. Rather, the government offered a story that aligned with national pride, and the public embraced it. The space race needed heroes, and Paperclip provided them, even if their biographies had been selectively edited in the years after the war. Yet beneath the celebrations and the triumphs, the truth lingered. It existed in sealed documents, in redacted security files, in whispered concerns raised by a handful of journalists and historians. It existed in the memories of survivors who knew that the engineers now designing America's future had once overseen their suffering. And it existed in the unresolved tension between America's ideals and its actions, a tension that would only grow sharper as the decades passed. These moral, geopolitical, and public angles formed the deeper layers of Paperclip, shaping the program's legacy and sowing the seeds of the reckoning that would come much later. For now, however, the story continued to move forward, propelled by the momentum of the Cold War and the belief that secrecy was both necessary and justified. But no secret remains buried forever, and the forces shaping Paperclip were already setting the stage for the moment when the truth would begin to surface. By the 1960s, the story of America's German scientists had become so woven into the nation's technological rise that few questioned the pasts of the men shaping its future. Wernher von Braun was now a familiar face on American television, explaining spaceflight with patient smiles and neat diagrams, while the rockets he and his team built thundered into the sky from Cape Canaveral. The country embraced the narrative of scientific triumph, but beneath the polished surface, threads of doubt began to tug at the fabric of the official story. A handful of investigative journalists, veterans, and historians started piecing together fragments that did not align with the government's sanitized accounts. Clippings from wartime archives, obscure references in old military reports, and testimonies from former concentration camp prisoners painted a picture far different from the one the public celebrated. The suspicion grew quietly at first, whispered in academic journals and niche publications. But as more researchers dug into the past, the idea that the United States had knowingly recruited men with questionable or even criminal wartime histories gained a foothold. This early unrest did not yet threaten the myth of American scientific purity, but cracked the surface just enough for light to seep through. By the 1970s, the cracks widened. Survivors of the Dora, Mittelbau camps, long scattered across Europe and the United States, began speaking more openly about what they had witnessed in the tunnels where the V-2 rockets were assembled. Their testimonies described starvation, beatings, and the relentless rhythm of work carried out under conditions so brutal that many prisoners died before completing a single month underground. Some survivors recognized names and faces from photographs of German engineers who were now living comfortably in the United States, contributing to NASA or American defense research. Their accounts reached journalists who were willing to listen, and slowly, reports began appearing that challenged the idea that all paperclip scientists had been innocent of wrongdoing. These emerging stories did not immediately alter policy or public opinion, but they created pressure that reached Congress at a moment when Americans were becoming more skeptical of government secrecy in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. In 1978, this growing skepticism culminated in a formal inquiry when the U.S. Government Accountability Office opened an investigation into allegations that former Nazi war criminals had entered and resided in the United States. Although the GAO's focus was broader than paperclip alone, its findings acknowledged that inconsistencies, oversights, and deliberate obfuscations had allowed individuals with deeply troubling histories to slip into American life. At the same time, the Department of Justice established the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, to identify, investigate, and prosecute Nazi war criminals living in the United States. OSI's work soon uncovered cases that intersected with earlier intelligence programs, revealing that some individuals had been admitted during the chaotic early post-war years through decisions shaped more by strategic competition than by legal or ethical clarity. These revelations amplified calls for greater transparency, particularly from survivor advocacy groups and Jewish organizations that had long demanded fuller disclosure of the U.S. government's wartime and post-war dealings. Yet the path toward transparency was uneven. While OSI pursued legal action against individuals who had concealed their Nazi affiliations, other branches of government resisted efforts to revisit or disclose their own wartime relationships. The intelligence community, in particular, argued that releasing historical files could compromise sources, expose operational methods, or disrupt diplomatic relations. This tension created a bureaucratic standoff. One part of the government was working to expose the truth, while another was quietly protecting secrets buried since the mid-1940s. The conflict simmered just below the surface, invisible to most Americans, but increasingly obvious to those engaged in the slow, methodical work of uncovering the past. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, historians, reporters, and human rights advocates were calling more loudly for the release of classified documents related to U.S. intelligence operations involving former Nazis. Their persistence kept the issue alive, transforming what had once been a fringe question into a matter of public accountability. As the Cold War neared its end, the rationale for secrecy weakened. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and the strategic justification for withholding information about mid-century intelligence programs began to fade. With geopolitical tensions easing, the United States found itself confronting a story it had long managed through omission and classification. The growing weight of historical evidence, survivor testimonies, and investigative reporting created a momentum that could no longer be stalled by quiet memos or bureaucratic delay. The files that no one had been allowed to see, the ones stored in basements, locked cabinets, and forgotten intelligence repositories, were now at the center of a national conversation about truth, responsibility, and the moral cost of Cold War decisions. It was in this shifting atmosphere, with the old world order dissolving and the demand for transparency rising, that the government would soon be forced into a reckoning no longer avoidable, a reckoning that would break open the sealed boxes and expose what had been hidden for more than half a century. The turning point arrived in 1998, when the United States Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, a piece of legislation that pierced through decades of sealed files, redacted reports, and quiet bureaucratic evasions. For the first time, the federal government was legally required to search, review, and declassify millions of pages related to Nazi war crimes and the post-war intelligence relationships that had grown from the ashes of World War II. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a direct response to years of pressure from historians, journalists, survivors, and advocacy groups who believed that significant portions of America's post-war dealings had been shielded from public view. To carry out the work, Congress created the Interagency Working Group, an unprecedented collaboration between the National Archives, the Department of Justice, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and other federal bodies. Their mandate was clear: identify every document that shed light on how the United States had interacted with former Nazis, whether as adversaries, fugitives, or, most controversially, assets recruited for scientific or intelligence purposes. What they found overturned long-held official narratives and forced the country to confront chapters it had preferred to forget. As archivists and investigators sifted through the classified vaults of multiple agencies, a complicated picture emerged. It revealed that American military and intelligence officials had not merely collected information from former Nazis. They had, in many cases, gone to significant lengths to recruit, relocate, and protect them. Some documents confirmed what had long been suspected: that during the early years of Paperclip, files had been cleaned of incriminating details, party affiliations removed, and SS ranks deleted, so that scientists deemed valuable could be safely admitted into the United States. Other records showed that the CIA and its predecessor organizations had hired former Nazi intelligence operatives during the Cold War, believing their networks and knowledge of the Soviet Union outweighed the moral problems posed by their pasts. These admissions were not abstract footnotes. They described deliberate decisions made at the highest levels of government, decisions that prioritized strategic advantage over ethical consistency in the tense years following Germany's defeat. The release of documents continued steadily over the next several years, revealing not just a handful of questionable decisions, but a systemic pattern of secrecy that stretched across decades. This growing archive painted a portrait of a nation that had been willing to compromise in the face of Soviet expansion, even if that meant ignoring the wartime atrocities linked to some of the individuals it quietly employed. Nowhere did the evidence strike harder than in files relating to the V-2 program and the underground camps of Dora, Mittelbau, where forced laborers had died in staggering numbers. The newly opened documents included reports, memos, and testimonies that directly contradicted earlier public claims that Paperclip scientists had been thoroughly vetted and found free of involvement in war crimes. Instead, it became clear that the desire to capture Germany's technological edge had prompted U.S. officials to obscure the extent of these men's connections to the Nazi system. In 2007, after nearly a decade of work, the Interagency Working Group submitted its final report to Congress. Its conclusions were measured but unmistakable. The United States had knowingly used individuals with Nazi ties for scientific and intelligence purposes, and the full truth of those relationships had been hidden through a combination of classification, bureaucratic maneuvering, and Cold War priorities. Although the report did not condemn the decisions outright, its calm, factual descriptions left little doubt about the moral weight of what had been done. For many Americans, the report marked the first time their government had openly acknowledged the scale of Paperclip's moral ambiguities. But the reckoning did not end there. In 2010, after prolonged internal debate and significant public pressure, the Department of Justice released its own long-suppressed history of the Office of Special Investigations. This document detailed the challenges OSI faced in identifying and prosecuting Nazi war criminals living in the United States and, crucially, outlined how other agencies had, in earlier decades, shielded certain individuals for strategic purposes. The report was blunt in places, acknowledging that some former Nazis had been allowed to reside in the country because of decisions made by intelligence and military officials during the early Cold War. Though the individuals involved had long since died or been deported, the release of the OSI history forced the country to confront In unprecedented detail, the consequences of choices once justified in the name of national security. Together, the declassified files, congressional reports, and internal histories formed a single, unavoidable truth. The United States had not only brought Nazi scientists into its fold, but had done so while obscuring their pasts, protecting their careers, and downplaying the human cost behind their wartime achievements. What had once been rumors, accusations, or scattered clues had now become a documented historical record. The long-held secrets were finally open, and the story they revealed was one that would push the nation into a new stage of reflection, one focused not on the race for technology, but on the consequences of the compromises made in pursuit of it. When the truth finally surfaced in the early 2000s, the revelations did not erase what Operation Paperclip had produced. They merely cast the achievements in a colder, more complex light. By then, the rockets built by Wernher von Braun and his team were long enshrined in American memory, celebrated as the engines that lifted astronauts into orbit and carried mankind to the surface of the moon. The towering Saturn V stood not only as a symbol of engineering mastery, but also as a reminder of a nation at the height of its confidence, projecting power into the heavens. Yet behind the gleaming metal and triumphant photographs lay the reality documented in the newly released files. That some of the scientific breakthroughs that had shaped America's technological identity had begun in tunnel networks where forced laborers starved, collapsed, and died under the weight of a system designed for exploitation. The duality was jarring. On one side stood the stunning contributions to space exploration, missile development, and the Cold War arms race. On the other stood the undeniable fact that these achievements were entangled with a past built on coercion, brutality, and silence. For decades, the United States had celebrated the former while quietly distancing itself from the latter. In Huntsville, Texas, New Mexico, and later at NASA facilities across the country, Paperclip scientists lived out careers that were, in many respects, the embodiment of the American dream. They became U.S. citizens, bought homes, taught at universities, led laboratories, and raised children who grew up never knowing the full extent of their parents' wartime work. Many neighbors saw them as brilliant immigrants contributing to a nation hungry for progress. The communities around Redstone Arsenal or the Marshall Space Flight Center spoke of them with admiration, associating their names with innovation rather than with the documents that had once required altered biographical notes. Even as the Cold War ended and declassification began to reveal uncomfortable truths, the legacy of these scientists remained tethered to the Cold War's emotional landscape, one in which the United States had triumphed through endurance, ingenuity, and strategic urgency. The nation did not easily reconcile the moral contradictions. Instead, it held both realities in uneasy parallel, acknowledging the darker history only when pressed, but continuing to celebrate the achievements that had shaped its global identity. Yet beneath the pride, a quieter reckoning took shape among historians, survivors, and policy analysts who understood that Paperclip's consequences extended far beyond the rockets that lit the Florida skies. They saw that the program had influenced not only America's technological momentum, but also its ethical boundaries. By recruiting individuals whose wartime actions intersected with a regime responsible for genocide and forced labor, the United States had set a precedent that national security could override questions of justice. The implications of that precedent rippled outward for decades, affecting how other Cold War alliances were forged, how intelligence networks were built, and how secrecy became normalized in the name of strategic necessity. This was not merely a story about rockets and engineers. It was a case study in how democracies confront, evade, or reshape their own values when faced with an existential threat. And it demonstrated that the pursuit of power, once entangled with moral compromise, often carries consequences far beyond those originally imagined. Even so, for millions of Americans who had watched the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions unfold, the achievements of Paperclip scientists were inseparable from the country's sense of identity. They had grown up seeing von Braun interviewed on television, hearing about missile tests in New Mexico, and watching grainy broadcasts of astronauts stepping onto the moon. The idea that some of these moments have been built on top of decisions made in the shadows did not erase their emotional significance. Instead, it forced a difficult question into the national conversation. Could a nation take pride in its accomplishments while still acknowledging the hidden costs behind them? It was a question that did not yield easy answers. But as the documents continued to emerge, the country could no longer pretend the cost did not exist. The truth had entered the public record, and the consequences of that truth, emotional, moral, and historical, would shape the debates that followed. And as the weight of these revelations settled, another question surfaced just as urgently. If America had gained so much from Paperclip, what had been lost in the process for survivors, for justice, and for the historical record itself? The revelations that followed, the declassification of Nazi-related files, did more than expose hidden decisions. They reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Across Europe and the United States, survivors of the camps where V2 parts were forged in suffocating darkness watched as the truth finally took shape in official documents. For many, the disclosures confirmed what they had long suspected, that individuals who once oversaw or benefited from her suffering had lived quietly under American protection, shielded by layers of secrecy and strategic necessity. Legal action, however, proved far more complicated. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, most of the scientists and operatives implicated in the files were elderly or had already passed away, leaving the Office of Special Investigations to focus on a shrinking pool of cases. OSI successfully stripped citizenship from several individuals who had concealed their Nazi affiliations, but those tied directly to Paperclip were often insulated by the passage of time and by the government's historic reluctance to pursue prosecutions in earlier decades. The result was a painful reality for survivors. The vast majority of former Nazis who reached the United States after the war, whether as scientists, engineers, or intelligence assets, were never tried in a court of law. But the impact of the newly opened archives reached far beyond the courtroom. Historians gained access to documents that reshaped scholarship on the immediate post-war years, uncovering how intelligence fears distorted early denazification efforts and how Cold War priorities steadily overshadowed moral concerns. Academics mapping the history of the V2 program gained clearer insight into the scale of forced labor at Dora, Mittelbau, the harsh conditions of its underground factories, and the degree to which its engineers were aware of the suffering that produced their wartime achievements. Likewise, researchers studying Cold War espionage and intelligence operations found detailed evidence of how U.S. agencies had recruited former Nazi officers to track Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, sometimes ignoring or softening their wartime pasts in internal assessments. These revelations shifted the narrative from one of isolated incidents to a broader understanding of institutional choices that reflected the pressures of a world locked in ideological and technological competition. As the evidence accumulated, the U.S. government faced its own reckoning. Officials from the Department of Justice and the National Archives issued statements acknowledging that earlier decisions within other agencies had complicated OSI's mission and, in some cases, allowed individuals who should have faced investigation to go undisturbed for years. These acknowledgments did not assign blame to specific individuals. Most had long since retired or died, but they marked a rare moment of institutional candor, an admission that the pursuit of strategic advantage had come at a moral cost. For those who had spent decades demanding transparency, the recognition was bittersweet. It offered validation, yet it also underscored how much time had been lost, how many stories had been buried, and how many perpetrators had escaped formal justice by the narrowing margin of age. Public reaction varied. Some Americans viewed the revelations with shock, unsettled by the idea that their government had deliberately obscured the pasts of men it publicly celebrated as scientific pioneers. Others accepted the disclosures with resignation, arguing that the Cold War had forced difficult decisions upon policymakers who feared Soviet dominance more than moral inconsistency. And many younger generations, raised with the moon landing as a distant historical triumph rather than a living memory, We're introduced for the first time to the uncomfortable origins of the technologies that had made it possible. The story, once fragmented across classified vaults and dusty archives, was now part of the broader national conversation about how democracies balance principle with survival, and how the sins of the past linger even when their protagonists are gone. In the end, the aftermath of Paperclip was not defined by trials or punishments, but by recognition. The recognition that the United States had gained unparalleled scientific power while sacrificing a measure of moral clarity, and that the victims whose suffering had made those wartime technologies possible were too often forgotten in the narratives that followed. And as the final documents were opened and the last sealed files reviewed, it became clear that the true legacy of Paperclip was not only the rockets that reached the moon, but the lingering shadow of everything that had been hidden along the way. In the end, the story of Operation Paperclip is less about rockets and scientists than it is about the choices nations make when standing at the crossroads of fear and opportunity. The files opened in the early 2000s revealed not only what the U.S. government had done, but why it had done it, and those reasons traced back to the same anxieties that often shape history: the fear of falling behind, the need to protect national security, and the belief that extraordinary times demand extraordinary compromises. Yet each newly uncovered document also showed the cost of those compromises, measured not in technological achievement, but in the moral clarity that was surrendered to obtain it. Beneath every launch plume and celebrated breakthrough lay questions that technology alone could never answer. Who is remembered? Who is forgotten? And what truths are allowed to exist only in shadows? For decades, the story of the scientists brought to America existed side by side with the story of the prisoners who died constructing their designs. But only one of those stories was told loudly, proudly, and without hesitation. When the archives finally opened, the silence surrounding the other became impossible to ignore. Still, the legacy of Paperclip is not a simple condemnation. It is a reminder that history rarely moves in straight lines, and that nations often make decisions in the fog of uncertainty, believing that survival depends on actions that later generations will judge starkly. The United States built extraordinary achievements from the knowledge it gained, achievements that advanced science, reshaped global power, and expanded humanity's reach. But those same achievements now serve as markers of a deeper truth: that progress, when built on selective memory, carries unresolved shadows forward with it. Today, the once sealed files sit open in climate-controlled archives, their brittle pages offering a quiet warning. They remind us that even in moments of triumph, the foundations beneath our victories may be more complicated than the stories we prefer to tell. And as history continues its march, the lesson remains: what a nation chooses to hide says as much about its character as what it chooses to celebrate.